now turn to Section 4. Section 4. You are going to hear a lecture delivered by a guest speaker on demographic changes. First, look at questions 31 to 36. As you listen, complete the lecture notes in the spaces provided.
Thank you for inviting me here to speak to you today at your Department of Social Sciences. As I'm sure you already know, the title of my talk, Europe Goes Grey, relates to the marked demographic change which has taken place in Europe since the 1960s. Just a few statistics showing the projected trends will illustrate this. By the year 2029, almost 1 in 4 of the population of the UK will be over the present retirement age of 60 years for women and 65 for men. By the year 2020, Italy, for example, will have both the oldest population, with 23.2% aged 65 and over, and, at the same time, the lowest fertility rate. Furthermore, a 1997 report from the UK Office for National Statistics notes that since 1950, the number of centenarians has increased at the rate of just under 7% a year, faster than for most other age groups, and will continue to do so into the next century. The main reasons for the generally increased lifespan are self-evident. These are simply a better diet, better housing, and above all, the ever-improving standard of health care. The social reasons for the changed demographic profile of Europe, that is, the increasing proportion of the elderly relative to the middle and steadily diminishing young generations, are, of course, the falling birth rate as a result of widespread birth control and the education and increasing participation of women in the workforce.
Before the speaker continues, look at questions 37 to 40. For these questions, there are 4 alternatives: A, B, C, and D. As you listen to the next part of the talk, decide which alternative is the most suitable answer and circle the appropriate letter.
This change raises 2 profound questions, one social and one economic, and it is these that I propose to examine here today. At the end, I intend to share with you a few thoughts on how we can help to make the lives of those in the third age more fulfilling and rewarding. Firstly, we need to recognize that the elderly are not a homogeneous group. They can range from a fit, active and independent 85-year-old to a 65-year-old with rapidly advancing Alzheimer's disease to a retired 55-year-old with both a dependent parent and still dependent student children. The social aspect I referred to earlier is, of course, the big question: who will care for the elderly? The question is a complex one, and I would like to illustrate this by making a few comparisons with the past. In earlier times, large extended families living in the same area were the norm. This meant the sharing of care for the grandparents' generation was usual. Now, however, the mobility of the population combined with smaller families often means there are, quite simply, no family members to take care of an older person. The breakdown of traditional family structures and the increase in divorce has exacerbated this. The other big question, the economic one, involves the increasing cost of adjustment to this situation and how the burden of this cost can most equitably be shared between, on the one hand, the elderly and their families, and on the other, the relatively smaller number of people of working age whose tax contributions have to be used to fund pensions and services for an increasingly elderly population, as well as all the other demands on the public purse. The questions raised by this demographic change are exercising governments all over Europe. and there is naturally widespread debate about how best to help financially those who can to remain independent, while supporting those who cannot, and ensuring that they continue a sometimes failing life with dignity. I promise to finish with a few thoughts about how we might come closer to achieving this. More imaginative use is being made of existing property by adapting it for elderly, often less able people, and their needs are now being kept in mind by planners, local authorities, and transport providers. But not forgetting the cry, where does the money come from? We need radically to rethink the arrangements for funding pensions and younger people's planning for retirement. Innovative insurance schemes should be developed to assist people in providing for the future, and financial institutions ought to be thinking about these. So I will close by repeating that I believe we should do everything to enable the elderly to live meaningful and rewarding lives. After all, we will be in the same situation all too soon. Thank you, and I would welcome any questions or comments from the floor.
That is the end of section 4. You now have half a minute to check your answers. The test is now finished. You now have 10 minutes to transfer your answers from the test booklet to your answer sheet. Now turn to section 4. Section 4. You're going to hear a lecture delivered by an actress on the difficulties that actors and actresses experience after graduating. First, look at questions 31 to 34. For these questions, there are 4 alternatives: A, B, C, and D. As you listen to the first part of the talk, decide which alternative is the most suitable answer for what you hear and circle the appropriate letter.
Good afternoon to you all again, and thanks for coming for the second lecture in the series, Drama After Graduating. For those of you who weren't here last week, my name is Jennifer Mackenzie Davis, and I'm one of those lucky ones, an actress with a job. I'm going to talk to you today about the difficulties actors and actresses face finding work. Not that any of you need reminding. It's a jungle out there, and you've got to be very hungry to survive. Are you hungry? Well, I'm afraid you're going to have to be, because if you aren't, you might as well pack your bags and forget all about acting as a career. And not just hungry, but also resolute in getting what you want. And of course, persistent, not to mention gifted. Between 80 and 90% of you will be out of work at any one time. You are joining a group of people whose average time in employment is 12 weeks a year for men and 7 weeks for women. Why do we do it? We must be mad. And yet there are thousands more waiting to take our places if we fail.
Now look at questions 35 to 40. As you listen, complete the lecture notes in the spaces provided.
Still hungry? Good, because this is where the interesting bit starts. Now we've got the stats out of the way. First of all, where do you look for work? Well, there's the Stage Door, the weekly newspaper which occasionally has a couple of decent jobs in it. And then there's the weekly list of jobs called TCR, but you need to subscribe to that with friends. It's very expensive, especially if you're out of work, about £20. No, sorry, £25 for 5 weeks. Then there's your agent. You'll discover sooner or later that you need an agent if you want to have access to the best work available. But how do you get an agent? Well, unless you're really very lucky and get taken on by an agent who just likes the look of you, you have to get an agent to see you in a live performance. This could be a good part in a play which shows off your talents, or a film role, or just a show reel of you performing your best speeches. I must say, I don't really know which is harder, getting the part without an agent in the first place, or getting an agent interested enough to come and see you. In other words, a real catch-22 situation. A word of warning, they don't usually travel more than a few hundred yards from their office. They're supposed to be working for you, but they actually behave like it's the other way round. As for showreels, if you want them to look at yours, you really need to tie them to a chair and force them to watch. You may find it difficult to get work without an agent, but it will be well nigh impossible without an equity card. Fortunately, things have changed. In the past, drama school students leaving here in July had what was known as a registered graduate equity card. This gave you 2 years to get an equity contract for work. Not that easy without experience, an agent or a full equity card. But even when you got your first job paid at equity rates, you received only a provisional equity card. The union was quite strict about membership, but the alternative was much harder and less likely to result in success. This provisional card could become a full one only after 30 weeks of work. Without it, you could forget the West End theatres, top tours and work in television. Now, however, things are a bit easier. After you finish from here, you automatically get your equity card. The downside of this is obviously that there are more people chasing the same number of jobs. But even before you start worrying about equity cards and your agent, you've got to establish yourself with photographs. Eye-catching and professional black and white photos, small postcard size for your publicity and CVs. There will be several sessions devoted to choosing the right photos that will show you off the way you are most likely to be cast. And also what to put in your CV and, more importantly with some of you, what not to include. So you see, it's not an easy road to fame and fortune. This has just been an introduction to the trials and tribulations of actors looking for work. Next week we'll make a start on CVs, but now it's time for a 10-minute tea break, followed by a question and answers session.
That is the end of section 4. You now have half a minute to check your answers. That is the end of the test. You now have 10 minutes to transfer your answers to your answer sheet.
Section 3. You will hear 2 students discussing a geography presentation they're going to give. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 26. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 26.
Remind me, Trevor, how long is the presentation?
Dr. White said 3 per hour.
So about 20 minutes.
Well, it'll be 15 minutes per presentation.
And 5 minutes for questions?
And is this one going to be assessed?
No, not this time round, because it's the first one, you know.
Oh, good news.
Well, Trevor, what are we going to include?
Well, do you think we ought to give some historical background?
Oh, no, definitely not. We won't have time.
OK, but I think we ought to say something about the geographical location, because not a lot of people know where the islands are.
Yes, OK. I'll take notes, shall I?
Yeah, that'd be a help.
So, geographical location?
Then we ought to give an overview of the whole education system.
Shouldn't we say something about the economy? You know, agricultural produce, minerals and so forth?
Well, Dr. White said we shouldn't go into that sort of detail.
But it's pretty important when you think about it, you know, because it does influence the education system.
Look, let's think about that one later, shall we? Let's see how we're doing for time.
OK, so general overview of education?
Of course. And then the role of English language.
No, that goes in the language policy seminar, don't you remember?
Are you sure?
Positive.
All right. So those are the topics we're going to be covering.
Before you hear the rest of the discussion, you have some time to look at questions 27 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 27 to 30.
We need to think about what to prepare. Dr. White said he wanted us to use plenty of visuals and things, and we might as well try them out when we're not being assessed.
Well, the most important thing is the overhead projector.
No problem. We'll get that from the media room. Must remember to book it.
Well, we'll need a map, of course.
Probably two. One of the islands, large scale.
And one of West Africa.
Well, the West African one is no problem. There's one in the resources room.
Oh, yeah, of course, the resources room. The islands are going to be more of a problem.
Tell you what, there's a very clear map of Santiago in that tourist brochure I showed you last week. Don't you remember it?
Oh, yeah, that's right. We can just use the tourist brochure.
We also need statistics on several different things.
Literacy rates.
Yes, and school places.
How about the encyclopedia?
Nah, not up to date enough.
Why don't we call the embassy?
Oh, someone's enthusiastic.
Well, if something's worth doing,
I know, it's worth doing well. OK.
we can find out statistics on school places from them as well.
Might as well.
Look, Julie, it's almost time for our tutorials. We can meet again on Monday, but we need to prepare some stuff before then.
That is the end of section 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to section 4. Section 3. You will hear a man inquiring about college courses. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 25. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 25.
Hi, can I help you?
I was told to come here because I'd like to talk to someone about taking a management course.
Right, I'm one of the tutors, so I should be able to help you.
Oh, good. My name's Brian Ardley. I've decided to enrol on a part-time management course. A friend of mine took one last year and recommended it to me.
Right.
Is there anything I should do before the course, like reading or anything?
We prefer to integrate reading with the course, so we don't give out a reading list in advance. But we like people to write a case study describing an organisation they know.
I've already done that, as my friend told me you wanted one. But would it be possible to sit in on a teaching session to see what it's like? I haven't been a student for quite a while.
Fine. Just let me know which date and I'll arrange it with the tutor.
Now, could I ask you about the college facilities, please?
Anything in particular?
Well, the course is 1 day a week, all day, isn't it? So presumably it's possible to buy food.
Yes, the refectory's open all day.
Does it cater for special diets? I have some food allergies.
Provided you warn the refectory in advance, it won't be a problem.
Good. What about facilities for young children? I'd like to bring my daughter here while I'm studying.
How old is she?
3.
Then she's eligible to join the nursery, which is supervised by a qualified nursery nurse. The waiting list for a place is quite long, though, so you ought to apply now.
OK.
I don't know if our careers advice service would be of any interest to you.
Yes, it might help me decide how to develop my career after the course.
The centre has a lot of reference materials and staff qualified to give guidance on a one-to-one basis.
I noticed a fitness centre next to the college. Is that for students?
It's open to everyone, but students pay an annual fee that's much less than the general public pay.
And presumably the college library stocks newspapers and journals as well as books.
Yes, and there's also an audio-visual room for viewing and listening to videos, cassettes and so on.
Is there also access to computers?
Yes, your tutor will need to arrange with the technical support team for you to get a password, so ask him or her about it when you start the course.
OK.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 26 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 26 to 30.
By the way, do you know about our business centre?
No, what's that?
It's a training resource, a collection of materials for people to study on their own or use in their own organisations.
Uh-huh. You mean books and videos?
Yes, and manuals for self-study, plus a lot of computer-based materials so people can work through them at their own speed and repeat anything they aren't sure about. And you can hire laptops to use in your own home or workplace, as well as printers that you can take away.
Does it have anything that I could use to improve my study skills? I don't have much idea about report writing, and I'm sure I'll need it on the course.
Oh, yes, there's plenty of useful material. Just ask one of the staff.
Does the centre cover all the main areas of business?
Yes, topics like finance and, of course, marketing, that's a popular one. Local managers seem to queue up to borrow the videos.
So it isn't just for students, then?
No, it's for members only, but anyone can join.
How much does it cost?
£100 a year for a company and £50 for an individual, with no discount for students, I'm afraid.
Well, that's very helpful. Well, I think that's all. I'd better go home and fill in the enrolment form. Thanks for all your help.
You're welcome. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
That is the end of section 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to section 4. Section 4. You will hear a talk on a social history of the East End of London. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
In the last few weeks, we've been looking at various aspects of the social history of London. And this morning, we're continuing with a look at life in the area called the East End. I'll start with a brief history of the district and then focus on life in the first half of the 20th century. Back in the 1st to the 4th centuries AD, when the Romans controlled England, London grew into a town of 45,000 people, and what's now the East End, the area by the River Thames and along the road heading north-east from London to the coast, consisted of farmland with crops and livestock, which helped to feed that population. The Romans left in 410, at the beginning of the 5th century, and from then onwards, the country suffered a series of invasions by tribes from present-day Germany and Denmark, the Angles, Saxons and Jutes, many of whom settled in the East End. The technology they introduced meant that metal and leather goods were produced there for the first time, and as the East End was by the river, ships could transport goods between there and foreign markets. In the 11th century, in 1066 to be precise, the Normans conquered England, and during the next few centuries London became one of the most powerful and prosperous cities in Europe. The East End benefited from this, and because there were fewer restrictions there than in the city itself, plenty of newcomers settled there from abroad, bringing their skills as workers, merchants or moneylenders during the next few hundred years. In the 16th century, the first dock was dug, where ships were constructed, eventually making the East End the focus of massive international trade. And in the late 16th century, when much of the rest of England was suffering economically, a lot of agricultural workers came to the East End to look for alternative work. In the 17th century, the East End was still a series of separate, semi-rural settlements. There was a shortage of accommodation, so marshland was drained and built on to house the large numbers of people now living there. By the 19th century, London was the busiest port in the world, and this became the main source of employment in the East End. Those who could afford to live in more pleasant surroundings moved out, and the area became one where the vast majority of people lived in extreme poverty and suffered from appalling sanitary conditions. That brief outline takes us to the beginning of the 20th century, and now we'll turn to housing. At the beginning of the century, living conditions for the majority of working people in East London were very basic indeed. Houses were crowded closely together and usually very badly built because there was no regulation. But the poor and needy were attracted by the possibility of work, and they had to be housed. It was the availability rather than the condition of the housing that was the major concern for tenants and landlords alike. Few houses had electricity at this time, so other sources of power were used, like coal for the fires which heated perhaps just one room. Of course, the smoke from these contributed a great deal to the air pollution for which London used to be famous. A tiny, damp, unhealthy house like this might well be occupied by 2 full families, possibly including several children, grandparents, aunts and uncles. Now, before I go on to health implications of this way of life, I'll say something about food and nutrition.
That is the end of section 4. You now have half a minute to check your answers. That is the end of the listening test. In the IELTS test, you would now have 10 minutes to transfer your answers to the listening answer sheet. Section 3. You will hear a discussion between a tutor and an education student called Sandy about the student's dissertation. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 25. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 25.
Hello, Sandy. How have you been getting on with your dissertation?
Fine. And I've been working hard on the various action points we agreed on our last tutorial. Do you want to talk me through what you've done?
Yeah, sure. Well, we agreed on 3 main targets for me to aim for. The first one was to find out about suitable data analysis software.
Yes.
And what I decided to do was to look through catalogues specialising in IT.
That's a good idea. What did you come up with?
I found the names of 2 promising ones.
Right.
But I also thought it'd be worthwhile talking to a lecturer.
Oh, right. Who did you see?
Jane Prince. Do you know her? She's in the computer centre?
Yes, of course. She's the new head.
Yes, well, she was very helpful.
Oh, that's good. Did she suggest anything in particular?
Yeah, she recommended software called VVAT and said I should book up for a couple of practice sessions using VVAT.
Great. I'm sure you'll find them useful.
And, of course, the second target was to draw up a survey checklist, which...
Yes, you emailed me it last week.
Have you had a chance to look?
Of course. I think it's good. Very much on the right lines. I'd say your first 2 sections are spot on.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't suggest that you change anything there, but in section 3 you really do need to have questions on teaching experience.
Yeah, I was thinking that section looked a bit short.
Right.
And my third target was do further reading on discipline.
Oh, yes. I mentioned a couple of writers, didn't I?
Yes, well, I got hold of the Banerjee, and I thought that was excellent, but I'm afraid I didn't manage to get hold of the essays about classroom management. You know, the ones by Simon Erickson. The bookshop said it was out of print, and the library doesn't have a copy.
Oh, right. And I'm afraid I've lent my copy to another student. What I suggest you do is try the library again. This time apply for it through the service called Special Loans. Have you done that before? You're entitled to 6 books a year.
Yes, no problem. That's what I'll do.
So, lots of useful work done.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 26 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 26 to 30.
So let's look at some new targets. We'll start by having a chat about your chapter 1. I very much enjoyed reading it. Your written style is very clear, and you've included lots of interesting descriptions of education in your target area. I've just got a couple of suggestions for some additional work.
Of course. Could I just ask, what do you think I should call it?
Well, I'd go for something like context review. What do you think?
Well, short and to the point.
Exactly. Now, as regards specific areas to work on, I'd be quite interested to have a few more statistics about the schools in the different zones.
Oh, that wouldn't be a problem. I can get them from the internet.
Great. And although you did make a reference to quite a few different writers, I think you should aim to cite more works written later than 2000.
OK. That's more difficult, but I can try. When do you want that done by?
Oh, it's not urgent. I should aim for the end of term. But in the meantime, I think you should also be thinking about Chapter 2.
Should I be drafting it already?
No, but I think you should note down its main sections.
Yes. You know, I always find that the hardest part...
I always find it helpful to put some ideas on index cards.
Yeah.
And then you can sort them and even lay them out on the floor. It's a real help.
Well, I'll certainly try it. Okay. When would the deadline be for that?
My advice would be to get it done before you embark upon the research. You can always change it later if you need to.
OK. I'll get going on that then.
That is the end of section 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers.